Hi everyone, my name is Megan and this is chapter 1 of our Biology 2E OpenStax textbook. So we are continuing on with our journey through the study of life, and we're doing this with the help of our OpenStax textbook Biology 2E, which can be accessed for free using this link, which will be in the notes below. Additionally, if you continue to like my chapter presentations, please click that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos that I post. Okay, so in the previous video, 1.1, we focused in on the first half of chapter 1, so that was the science of biology. So we're going to continue with the rest of chapter 1, focusing on the themes and concepts of biology. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify and describe the properties of life, describe the levels of organization among living things, recognize and interpret a phylogenetic tree, as well as list examples of different sub-disciplines of biology. Okay. So let's start out by basically describing the properties of life. So here is just a long list of the 7 properties of life. Now, I've looked through a number of different textbooks, and I've taught out of many different types of textbooks. And so the properties of life in each textbook may vary. So in our OpenStax Biology 2E textbook, we are focusing on what we consider 7 properties of life. Just recognize not all textbooks have these 7 exactly. They might have more or less, or combine some together. So in our textbook, we have order as being a property of life, and I'll go into detail what that means in just a second. Sensitivity or response to stimuli. So living things are sensitive and respond to stimuli. Living things reproduce, must be able to, pass on their genes to the next generation. Living things grow and develop, okay? And living things have some sort of regulation. We'll talk about that. As well as maintain homeostasis, maintaining internal conditions while the environment is changing surrounding that organism. And then all living things process energy. So we're going to go through each one of these properties of life in detail. So if you didn't get the whole list, that's okay. So we're going to start out with the first one, order. So what is order? So order, it basically means that if we take a look at an organism, inside that particular organism, such as our toad here, you see order within. So we might see different systems inside. We see a way that this organism, our toad, is able to take in gas, in this case oxygen, through his or her lungs, and then that oxygen can then be transferred to the cells that need it via the circulatory system through the blood. Okay, so there's order, there's an organized structure to this organism, and it consists of different order of big to small, small to big, however you want to categorize it. So this organism is made of organ systems, and those organ systems are made of different organs, and those organs are composed of tissue, and those tissues are formed by cells. So there's this structure, hierarchical order of organization. And we'll talk more about that structure later on, by the way. The second property of life in the textbook is that life responds to stimuli. So that means that, it will react to changes around it. And so here we have an example of this sensitive plant that will actually droop or fold when it's touched. So if I, just reach out and touch that plant, the leaves will actually kind of, respond to that stimuli by trying to move away, as a plant can do. I mean, it can't run away from a source, but it can kind of droop away. And then it just returns to normal afterwards. So living things are able to do that. A rock cannot do that. It can't, you know, when it starts to rain, you know, maybe move to a place that doesn't get exposed, because it's not a living thing. So living things respond to stimuli. This is a link from your textbook that actually shows that response, so I wanted to show it to you. So let me bring it over. So this is a YouTube video.
That your sunflowers move a little, you're not losing it. They might just be following the sun across the sky. So I can text Matt Brooks, kind of with a biologist, to find out why your sunflowers might be pointing in the opposite direction at the end of each day.
No, you're not going crazy. Young sunflowers really do follow the sun from east to west and back on most days. Biologists and researchers say it has to do with sort of internal clock.
Just like you and me, that regulates our sleep patterns, plants have a circadian clock as well. And in the case of solar tracking, they help to have the plant follow the sun throughout the day.
The sunlight-sensitive leads, along with the internal circadian clock, help to physically tilt the sunflower.
That causes hormones to be distributed differently on the different sides of the plants, and that causes unequal growth.
You'll find that after a while, your sunflowers may just look east once they're fully grown.
But there's a benefit to them facing east when they're mature, and that's to help attract pollinators in that warm morning sun.
If you would like to learn more about the science of moving sunflowers, just head over to our website, WTHITV.com. In Terre Haute, Matt Brooks, News 10.
Okay, so again, that was a cute video that actually showed how our sunflowers they actually do move, and they're responding to the availability of sun. So it is something that even a plant, which you might not think, plants pretty stationary other than maybe wind blowing their leaves, they do respond to the sun, which is a really interesting phenomenon. Another property of life is that living things reproduce. So we need to make sure that our genes, our DNA, is passed on to the next generation. So we do that through reproduction. Okay, so you can see here we got Mama Cat, and she has given birth to her litter of kittens. So she has successfully passed on her genes to the next generation. Okay. We also see another property of life in this picture, growth and development. So that basically means that we might not share the same exact characteristics from the time that we are formed, conceived, whether it's a single fertilized egg or a baby born or something like that, to our mature state. So, different organisms, whether it be plants, bacteria, so forth, they may look differently from the time when they first existed. And so this is due to this idea of growth and development. So we need to, if it were a multicellular creature, such as our cat here, once two cells merge, sperm and egg merge, it becomes a fertilized egg. And from there, that fertilized egg is going to divide into 2 cells, into 4 cells, into 8 cells, until you get a clump of cells. And then from there, it becomes starts to differentiate into something that resembles a little embryo. And from there, it develops even further and start looking like a little baby kitten, inside the mother's womb, but not completely. It still looks kind of weird. And then it's born, and you got a little kitten that has, the big face compared to its body size. And then you see the kitten grow, and the kind of face structure that's so cute starts to even out in the size and become more proportional until you get this adult cat. So this idea that living things, they grow and they develop. Okay, doesn't always have to go through this process. So, plants, they do something very different. We have, for example, think about what happens when you plant a seed. So it's just this little thing, and then it grows into this little seedling that emerges with usually just 2 little leaves, and then gets bigger and then develops into something that resembles the adult form. Okay, so there's different types of growth and development based on whatever organism we're studying. Regulation and homeostasis are another two properties of life. So regulation, that might mean that we are trying to regulate different processes within our body systems. So we need to, for example, we need to have a system of gas exchange so that our cells can get the oxygen that they need in order to undergo cellular respiration to produce cellular energy, and need to have a way to get rid of the carbon dioxide that is produced as a byproduct from that process. Okay, so we have to make sure that our body systems can be regulated in a sense that the cells are getting what they need when they need them, and waste products are removed from that. Another property of life is that living things need to be able to maintain homeostasis. So homeostasis means that inside the organism, whether it's a single-celled organism or a multicellular organism such as our polar bear, that organism is going to be pretty stable inside, even if the environment they are in changes. So for example, think about the polar bear. The polar bear, if I took his temperature right now, probably would be around 900 degrees Fahrenheit. And so because of, even though it's living in this cold environment, that's what maybe in this condition it's below freezing. And so how can the body of inside that polar bear be so much warmer than the existing environment around it? So it's doing certain things to keep its body at a consistent temperature, even as the temperature outside it is fluctuating. So that's homeostasis. So that's required to maintain life, because a lot of our processes that are going on, all of our chemical reactions are going on within our body. A lot of times they have to be done at a certain temperature, certain pH, certain amount of water, things like that. So we have to kind of maintain that balance to ensure that those reactions can occur. Energy processing is another example of property of life. So energy processing is basically taking one form of energy and converting it to another form. So for example, think about how you obtain energy. Well, we have to think back to what we ate because that's going to help us get the energy. So we obtain our energy through our food sources. So whatever we ate for breakfast is going to get broken down into our digestive system. So it goes from this, actually it came from another living thing, okay, a plant, animal, whatever you're eating for breakfast. But that is a form of energy that then gets broken down. And then that chemical energy that we've taken in through our diet then can get converted to another form of energy known as cellular energy, ATP, which is the energy that our cells use. So that transfer of energy, we're converting it from a chemical form to a cellular form. So that's processing energy. Think about what plants do. They don't eat. So how do they get their energy? Well, they use sunlight, okay? So photosynthesis is an example of taking light energy from the sun and converting it to, or processing it to form chemical energy, sugars and starches and things like that. So that process of energy processing is something that is a unique property of life. And then the final property of life is the idea of evolution. So that's something that living things have over time. Populations have evolved. So that means on just the most basic scale that in order for us to survive, we need to get resources in order to survive. So that means that we have food, shelter, water, all those things in order to survive. While the strongest in our population that's able to obtain those resources needed for survival will survive long enough to reproduce. Okay, so think of, I always use the eastern gray squirrel population for some reason. So within that population of squirrels, the ones that have the best genetic makeup to allow them to gather the most resources are going to survive the longest, pass on those genes to the next generation. Okay, so over time, the squirrel population in general becomes more adapted to the environment, okay, because they are made up of their ancestors that passed on those genes that allowed them to survive. And so evolution is just an accumulation of all of those random mutations and changes in genes, in the genetics, that were passed on over time. So it's just an accumulation of that, allowing the population as a whole to become better adapted to that environment over time. Okay. So now that we've gone through the different properties of life, we're going to take a closer look at the levels of organization. So remember how I talked about one of the properties of life being that life has order to it. Well, we can actually see that order within all living things. Okay, so for example, here are our levels of organization. So if I think of an organism, I always use the eastern gray squirrel for whatever reason. So that organism, I can look at the smallest component within that organism and get it all the way down to a single atom. So what is an atom? An atom is just the smallest unit of matter that retains the properties of an element. So I could think of an atom of carbon, an atom of oxygen, an atom of calcium within the eastern gray squirrel. Now, if I put two or more atoms together, I form a molecule. Okay, so a molecule consists of at least two atoms held together by some sort of chemical bond. So for example, if I take our oxygen and combine it with another oxygen with a double bond, it forms an oxygen molecule that has two oxygen atoms there. I can even take it at a larger scale and have multiple molecules form connected together to form a macromolecule. So for example, we'll later in further chapters, we'll get into the macromolecules of life, which are 4 of them. We focus in on carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So if I take, for example, a protein is made up of molecules of amino acids. So this macromolecule protein is made up of the monomers, we call them, amino acids linked together through bonds, peptide bonds, to form this bigger molecule protein, which is through a process formed through something called polymerization. We'll talk more about that in subsequent chapters. So if you look at the smallest scale of that eastern gray squirrel, you might see that there are proteins and nucleic acids and carbohydrates and lipids within that eastern gray squirrel, that each one of those macromolecules are made of molecules, and each one of those molecules are made of atoms. Now, if we take the proteins and the lipids and the carbohydrates and nucleic acids, we can actually form different organelles within a cell. So I like to think of an organelle as an organ of a cell, okay? So we can't call them organs because an organ would be like a heart. Well, hearts are made of a lot of cells, so you can't think of so it's like an organ within the actual cell structure. So within our cell structure, we have different organelles that have different functions. So for example, an organelle could be a nucleus. The nucleus houses the DNA, the nucleic acids. The mitochondrium is an organelle that is considered the powerhouse of the cell that can take in the fuel, such as glucose, and convert that chemical energy into cellular energy that the cell can use. Okay, so organelles are aggregates of different types of macromolecules surrounded by membranes. Okay, and then the smallest unit of life. Basically, the smallest unit of life means that has all the different properties of life we describe are known as cells. So cells can process energy. Cells can grow and develop. Cells can reproduce. Cells can evolve, or populations of cells can evolve. Cells can regulate. Cells can maintain homeostasis. Cells have order to them. So our cell, they respond to stimuli. It's basically the smallest unit of life that, has all of these properties of life. Anything smaller than that doesn't have all the properties of life. So for example, an organelle within the cell is not considered living because it doesn't have all of the properties of life. Okay? So cells are the smallest fundamental unit of life. Now, I can take every single cell in the entire Earth and divide it into two categories. We have prokaryotic cells and we have eukaryotic cells. So a prokaryotic cell is a single-celled or colonial organism that does not have a membrane-bound nucleus. So remember, nucleus was an example of an organelle. Organelle would be an aggregate of macromolecules that have a certain function. So a nucleus houses genetic information. So a nucleus contains, different macromolecules, and it has DNA and RNA and other things inside that are nucleic acids and so forth. Well, prokaryotes don't have that membrane-bound nucleus. Instead, the DNA is just sitting in the cytoplasm of the cell. So that is a different type of cell. The other type of cell we study are eukaryotes. So eukaryotes do have a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles, okay? So in order for a cell to exist, it does not have to have organelles. That would be prokaryotes, okay? Eukaryotes, they do have membrane-bound organelles, okay? So they're more complex. If we take a look at our human cells, we are made of eukaryotic cells. If I take one of your cheek cells from inside your mouth and put it under a microscope, I would see that the cheek cell has a nucleus and has other organelles inside. If I, scrape a sample of bacteria off of your skin and look at that bacteria under a microscope, those bacteria cells don't have membrane-bound organelles. They don't have a nucleus, so they're considered prokaryotic. Okay, so just two different types of cells. If we put multiple cells together that are similar in structure and function, they form a tissue. So groups of similar cells carrying out similar tissue or similar or related functions. So for example, in our human body, we have epithelial tissue, okay? We have connective tissue, we have muscular tissue, and we have nervous tissue. So these are just, types of tissue that are made up of similar types of cells. And they work together to form similar functions. So think of what a nervous tissue would do. So it's going to be sending, signals throughout your body to communicate, okay? Then, if we have a collection of tissue grouped together to form, they can form an organ which has a certain function to it. So for example, I might think of, let's say the organ, the heart, okay? So the heart, human organ, that is made of different types of tissue. So it actually contains the muscle tissue, okay? It also, that, helps pump the heart, and constrict and so forth. We have connective tissue in the form of blood vessels, and blood is the connective tissue. We have nervous tissue. We have nervous tissue throughout the structure of the heart to send those electrical impulses and so forth. And we have epithelial tissue that helps protect and surrounds the heart and the chambers of the heart and so forth. So those are, different types of tissue that work together for a certain function in an organ. An organ system is where we have functionally related organs. So for example, our heart is just a single organ within our cardiovascular system, our organ system. So that cardiovascular system also involves the blood vessels. It can involve, you can even consider it involving the lungs, because we're taking in oxygen into the blood and carrying it throughout. So it's a group of different organs that function together for a related function of delivering oxygen throughout the body's to the cells that need them. And then finally, if we have a number of organ systems working together, we form an organism. So humans, we have our cardiovascular system, we have our digestive system, we have our respiratory system, we have all sorts of systems within our body of different organs. Now, you might be thinking right away, do all organisms have organ systems and organs and tissues? No. Okay, so this is just kind of an idea of a level of organization. If I look at a tree, it doesn't have a heart, it doesn't have a cardiovascular system, but it might have something, similar to distribute the sugars throughout the body. It has the phloem, and then the xylem distributes like the water and so forth. So this is not specific for all organisms of life. Okay, these levels of organisms are not found in every single living thing. Okay. Now, we can even go further past the organism level. So the organism level, we can actually go higher up. We can look at the population level of organization, or the population level of our life's hierarchy. So that means that we're looking at all individuals living in a specific area at a specific time. The eastern gray squirrel, I always go back to that example. The eastern gray squirrel is an individual, but there's multiple eastern gray squirrels living in, for example, my backyard, okay? And so that would be considered a population. They're all the same species, and they're all living in the same area, okay, at the same time. So that would be considered a population. We could study a community level of life's hierarchy or organization. This would include not just a specific population, but all the different populations inhabiting the area. So for example, if I'm studying my backyard community, I'm not just studying the eastern gray squirrel population. I could be studying the dark-eyed junco population, or the different Douglas fir tree population, or whatever the different species, different populations that are in my backyard, and how they are kind of interacting. Okay, so my bird feeder, I have the dark-eyed juncos getting the birdseed, but then the eastern gray squirrels are also there, and so how are they interacting together? And we have trees that provide shelter for them, and so forth. So community level is looking at all of the different populations inhabiting an area. Okay. We can even go further in looking at the ecosystem level of life's hierarchy. So the ecosystem level looks at the living component within an area, but also the non-living component. So that includes the climate, it includes the water, okay, streams, precipitation, all that. It includes the substrate, the soil, the topography, all of that is interacting together with all the living things. So that's an ecosystem level. So looking at the living things within a particular area with the non-living elements, okay? And then finally, we can look at the broadest level of organization, the biosphere. So think bio means life, sphere, think Earth, globe. So it's the collection of all the living, all the ecosystems on Earth representing the zones of life on Earth. So our biosphere. Okay. So here's just a figure from your textbook that describes the levels of organization. So we have, remember the cell being the fundamental unit of life, the smallest unit of life. So human blood cells. Well, within the blood cells, we can study the organelles of the blood cell. So we can see, well, this isn't a blood cell tissue, I can tell, but within the cell itself, there might be, this is some sort of plant cell here, but we can see different organelles, like these little stained areas are the nuclei. Okay, oops. So the organelles make up the cells. Tissues are made up of cells. So here we can see the human skin tissue. So we can actually see up here, we can see kind of the epithelial cells that make up the epithelium, a type of tissue system within our skin. We can look at the organ, okay? So the organ, we can see different organs within our digestive tract. So we have like the small intestine, the large intestine, the liver, produces the bile and so forth. So this could be different organs working together to form our digestive system. And remember, the organs are made up of the tissues. And then we have our organism, okay? So within that organism, we see the different organ systems that are made up of organs, that are made up of tissues and so forth. We can also go beyond the organism itself and the individual and look at a population of the same species, okay? Or maybe we can look at all the populations within an area of the different species and see how they interact together. That would be an example of a community. Or we can include the abiotic factors, okay? The soil, the climate, the water, the topography, all that could also be included with the living component to form an ecosystem. Or we can focus on the biosphere, so all the living systems on Earth. Okay, so here's a question for you. This is from our visual connection questions from our textbook. So which of the following statements is false? So use the picture on the left to kind of help you figure out which one of these is false. So let's start with the first statement. Tissues exist within organs, which exist within organ systems. So they're saying that tissues exist within organs and organs exist within organ systems. Is that true or false? Yeah, that's true. Okay, so tissues like human skin tissue can be found within an organ, and then that organ can be found within an organ system. So this statement is true. Communities exist within populations, which exist within ecosystems. Is that true or false? Well, let's look at our order here. It says communities exist within populations. Well, aren't communities different populations? I think this one's false, okay? So communities, so it should be switched. Populations exist within communities, which exist within ecosystems. So this one is false. The order is switched. Okay, so populations exist within communities, communities exist within ecosystems. So this one's false. Let's see if there's any other false ones. Organelles exist within cells, which exist within tissues. Organelles exist within cells, that's true, which exist within tissues. That's true. That's the correct order. Communities exist within ecosystems, which exist within the biosphere. Communities exist in ecosystems, yep, that exists within a biosphere. That's a correct order as well. So the one that's incorrect is this one. All right, so let's go through some review questions to finish off chapter 1. So the smallest unit of biological structure that meets the fundamental requirements of living is what? Is it the organ, the organelle, the cell, or the macromolecule? If you chose cell, I would agree with you. So just going back, remember how the cell is the smallest unit of life that contains all of the properties of life. Okay, smaller than a cell, an organelle, for example, does not have all the properties of life. Okay. Viruses are not considered living because, well, let's think of the different properties of life. Okay, Viruses. Can you give an example of a virus? Well, I can think of a prominent example that's always in the news, the COVID, coronavirus. So this is not considered living. Viruses are not considered living because they're not made of cells. This thing right here is an example of a virus. It doesn't contain organelles, and it doesn't follow all the properties of life. So therefore, it's not considered living. When we go back to the properties of life, if we think of the virus, can it replicate on its own? It cannot. It actually tricks a host cell into replicating another virus cell. So since it can't reproduce on its own, it is not considered living. Okay, it does contain some of the properties of life. For example, viruses can evolve. How many different variants of the coronavirus do we have? It can evolve. So it has some properties of life, but not all of them, and therefore it's not considered living. And so it doesn't contain, it's not made of cells. That's the most fundamental unit of life. So they're not considered living because they're not made of cells. Okay. Yeah, they don't contain a cell nuclei, but neither do prokaryotes, so that's not a correct answer. They do contain genetic material, whether it being DNA or RNA, so that's not true. They can reproduce, but they need a host cell to do that. So the reason why they're not considered living is because they're not made of cells. Here's another question. The presence of a membrane-enclosed nucleus is a characteristic of, is that a prokaryotic cell, a eukaryotic cell, living organisms, or bacteria? If you chose eukaryotic cell, I would agree with you. So our eukaryotic cells, such as our human cells, they contain membrane-bound nuclei. Not all living organisms have a nucleus in their cells, like our bacterial friends that are prokaryotic. So eukaryotic is the correct answer. A group of individuals of the same species living in the same area is called, is that a family? Is that a community? Is that a population? Or is that an ecosystem? If you chose a population, I would agree with you. Now, with us humans, just in our society, we think of a community as a group of humans living in the same area because, you have your community that you interact with. Just remember in biology, community is all species interacting together, or populations of all species. So a population is a group of individuals of the same species. Okay. And then we have which of the following the following sequences represents the hierarchy of biological organization from the most inclusive to the least complex. So go back to that hierarchy, that order. Which one is the correct order? Well, let's see. We have organelles form tissues. Do tissues form a biosphere? I think we skipped a couple steps there, so it's not that one. Organs are found in an organism. That's true. An organism is found in tissue. Out of order. Not that one. An organism is in a community. Yeah, it can be in a community. That community is part of the biosphere. Yeah, that's true. A biosphere is part of a molecule. Not the correct order. All right, so I bet you it's this last one. So biosphere is made up of ecosystems. That's true. Ecosystems are made up of communities. That's true. Communities are made up of populations. That's true. Populations are made up of organisms. I think that's the winner. And this one goes from most inclusive, all living things on Earth, to least complex. Okay? All right, so the last part of chapter 1 deals with the diversity of life. So I mentioned before that we can take all cells within the entire biosphere and divide them into two categories. They're either prokaryotic or eukaryotic cells. They either contain a membrane-bound nucleus, being eukaryotic, or they do not contain membrane-bound organelles, so they're prokaryotic. Well, we can take it a step further, and we can describe all living things on Earth and place them into just 3 categories. They could be bacteria, they could be archaeans, or they could be eukaryotes. Okay, so what's the difference? So all the species on Earth, which is, a lot. Right now we have 1.8 million species described. There's probably anywhere from 10 to 100 million species out there. So we can place all of those species into one of these 3 categories: bacteria, archaeans, or eukarya. So basically, 2 of them are made of prokaryotic cells. So bacteria and archaeans are actually composed of prokaryotic cells. They don't have nucleus within their cell. Eukarya is the domain that contains the eukaryotic cell organisms. So we, for example, are part of domain eukarya. Okay. We can even take it a step further, and within the domain eukarya, which includes plants, it includes animals, it includes paramecium and mushrooms and fungi, all that stuff. We can divide those into further kingdoms and so forth. So how do we keep track of this diversity of life? Well, one way is by using something called a phylogenetic tree. So this is just basically describes the diversity of life in a format where we can not only see how closely related different types of organisms are to each other, but also how they're connected to more distantly related organisms. So we can construct this thing called a phylogeny. Now, if we take a look at this phylogeny, there's a couple of things that you'll notice. Right away, it looks kind of like a tree. Hey, that's why it's called a tree. But it looks like, you have kind of a trunk, and then you got like the branches, and then the branches divide into further branches and so forth. So when you're reading one of these phylogenetic trees, you can see the outside parts of the tree contain in most cases, the existing species on Earth, or the existing categories. So we have, for example, if you look over on this area, you see animals, fungi, plants. Those might stick out to you as something that you recognize. Okay, so these are existing, living things. Sometimes they will also include extinct living things. So things that have existed in the past as well. But if you follow a specific group of organisms, in this case, such as the animals, you can see, if you follow it down, you'll see that it ends where there's a connection, okay? That's actually called a node. And that is going to show a common ancestor. And it also shows the distance of time that's taken place. So if we look at this phylogeny of life, all the living species on Earth, okay, we can see that animals and fungi and plants, they all are more closely related to each other than, say, animals are to green filamentous bacteria. Okay, so we're more closely related to a fungus or a plant than to a gram-positive bacteria. Okay, hey, that makes sense. So you can see, based on the placement of these branches and where the nodes are located, to determine the ancestry and how recent the ancestry or how distant the ancestry is. So these are the branches, and then at the tips are where the specific species are. Okay. The closer you are to within the branch to the main branches, that's the more recent. The further back you are, the least recent, okay, or more distance. So based on that information, where in a phylogenetic tree would you expect to find the organism that had evolved most recently? Would it be at the base of the tree? No. Within the branches, like here? No. At the nodes? No. At the branch tips? Yes. Okay, so these are the ones that show the most recently evolved. All right. All right, so that wraps up chapter 1 of the study of life. If you are taking a look at the OpenStax website for your textbook, under the textbook, there's also within the review questions, there's some critical thinking questions. So that might be a good idea for you to work through to make sure that you fully understood all of the concepts that were introduced within the chapter. Again, if you want to keep up with all of the different chapters I post, please click that subscribe button, and I will see you in chapter 2.